In this episode of Akram's Ideas, I'm going to show you how to put in a bias tape facing around the armholes. So stay tuned! Hello and welcome. I'm Akram Burris, and you're watching Akram's Ideas, bringing creative and crazy ideas to life. In this Learn to Sew episode of Akram's Ideas, I'm going to be showing you how to put in a bias tape armhole facing.
In our previous Learn to Sew video, we talked about adding a traditional facing around the neckline.
Now, the armholes traditionally, if we take a look at this blouse here, traditionally have the same feature. You can see here I have some armholes, and because we don't have a sleeve in this garment, there's no way to take care of that raw edge. So if we look on the inside, you can see I have a traditional armhole facing, which is basically just cut in the shape of the armhole and sewn to the inside. You can again see that it's sandwiched in between here are the raw edges of our armhole. And it basically just goes between the wrong side of your garment and the outside of your garment. So it sits inside here. And we do it wrong side to wrong side so that if any little bit may show up, you'll see the pattern and not the wrong side of fabric. But with a couple of techniques, you shouldn't even see that facing. Now, as I said before, we're going to be using a bias tape facing for our armholes. And one of the things you'll notice with this blouse is that it's got this rather large size facing on the inside. And sometimes, especially in the armhole area, it can start to wear on you. It can start to feel a little uncomfortable. And if you're using thicker fabric, it can make the garment look a little bulky when you're using both neckline and armhole facing. So an alternative is to use bias tape facing. For the project that we'll actually be working on in this episode, I will be using Vintage Simplicity Pattern 7655, and as you can see, I've got it here on my mannequin tailor, and we'll be adjusting the armholes with bias tape facing. Now, these techniques and tips that I'm going to show you in this video can apply to any garment in which you want to replace the traditional facing with a thinner bias tape facing. This pattern, like most patterns, has a facing piece for the armhole. Instead of doing a traditional facing, I'm going to do a bias tape facing. And a bias tape facing can be done on the neckline, just like I'm going to show you on the armhole. It works best if you're not using a collar because you want that extra weight a lot of times when you're using a collar. But if you're just doing a straight neckline, you can also do a bias tape facing basically as your hemline as well. It works really well with curves. So if I take a look at the other arm here, I'm going to show you kind of the finished armhole with the bias tape, and you can see the bias tape on the inside here. So for this project, you are going to need bias tape, and I just have single fold bias tape. And it's called bias tape because it's a strip of fabric that has been cut and sewn together on the bias. So it's the stretchy part of the fabric. And this is why bias tape is so good when you're working with curves. So because we're using bias tape for our facing, as you'll notice, our bias tape's pretty small width-wise when it comes to our standard seam allowance, which is 5/8 inches. 5/8 inch, which is a standard seam allowance. So what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to refer to your pattern and determine what your seam allowance for your arm cycle is. In my case, it was 5/8. So you're going to mark your 5/8 inch seam allowance, and then you're going to mark a 1/4 inch from that. And the reason being is that we're only going to need a 1/4 inch seam allowance when we're working with a bias tape facing. Now you can do this with a fabric marker or whatever you want. My favorite way to do this is just to take a basting stitch, because it's marked on my sewing machine where the 5/8 inch seam allowance is. So I sew the 5/8 inch seam allowance, and then from there I measure back out a 1/4 inch, and so I measure my 1/4 inch and I stitch the 1/4 inch seam allowance. You're going to want to take that 1/4 inch mark that you've made, again it's 1/4 inch from the 5/8 inch mark, and you're going to want to trim the armhole to that mark. So I'm just going to take my arm cycle here, and I'm just going to cut right on that line. And again, I've done this using a basting stitch, so it was easy to see, and cutting right on that will actually take up the thread out so you won't even see it. And now what I can do is I can take that original 5/8 line that I made with the basting stitch, I can go ahead and take that line out, that line of thread out. So I've trimmed away the excess of our armhole and took out any remaining basting stitches so that they don't show up in our finished product. And basically I'm taking my single fold bias tape, and what you'll notice about bias tape is that one side is folded a little bit smaller than the other side. What we're going to do is we're going to take the smaller side and we're going to open it up, and so this is the outside that's folded and this is the inside, and we're going to put right sides together. There are different ways that we can prep our bias tape for the armhole. A lot of people take a tape measure and measure their armhole and then cut the accordion bias tape, sew up the edges, create a circle, and then fit it around their armhole. I don't like to do that. I'm always worried that I'm going to measure wrong and everything. So what I like to do instead is actually pin this directly to the armhole, overlap it, and then trim it off. Before we do that though, you'll notice that I've got a raw edge on my bias tape, and this is going to show on the inside if I don't do something about it. So what I'm actually going to do before I even start pinning it to my armhole here is I'm going to take the bias tape, I'm going to open it up, and I'm going to fold in ever so slightly so that that raw edge is now on the inside. I'm going to fold down my wide side, and again we're working with the smaller fold. So this is the outside, this is the inside, or the right side and the wrong side. So I've got this folded in, and I'm going to take this smaller folded area and right sides together. I'm going to start right at the side seam, just like so, and I'm going to pin it to my armhole, matching the top edges of the bias tape with the top edge of my armhole here. And I'm just going to go around and do that all the way around. I've pinned the bias tape all the way coming to our end, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this ending piece and I'm going to come around and I'm going to overlap where I had that original fold. And because this is going to actually be on the inside, we won't see this bit here. So I'm going to put it over, and I'm going to take my scissors here and I'm going to trim this off. And the great thing about this is that I know for sure now that these are going to match up. It's going to fit my armhole. And as you can see on the other side, the pin side, that fold that I made is going to encase that raw edge. So I'm going to talk about how I'm going to finish that up when we get to the sewing machine. But what we're going to do now is we're going to take this to the sewing machine, and what we're going to do is what we call stitch in the ditch. There's a crease line where our bias tape was folded, and basically we're going to be following that fold line, that ditch that's been made, and we're going to stitch all the way around. As you can see, I've got my bias tape pinned to my armhole, and we're going to stitch in the ditch, that folded crease where the bias tape we unfolded, I've got my needle lined up so it's going to sew along that fold. And I'm starting here where we've got our overlap at the bottom of the armhole. It's kind of a good idea to start there on the under armhole, because if you find out that you got the wrong stitch setting or something, it's not as noticeable because it'll be underneath your arm, so you won't notice that. So you want to make sure you start there, so if you've got any snags or something, you'll notice them right away. You'll fix that and you won't have any visible portion of the armhole with any flaws. So again, I'm going to just stitch all along this folded crease here. As you can see, I've gone ahead and I've stitched it all the way around, and now we need to address that little lip that we have here. You'll remember that I folded it in and I stitched it, and so now what we need to do before we continue on is we need to go ahead and stitch the two pieces of bias tape, the two ends of bias tape together. And so what I like to do for that is just to bring it under my needle where the sides meet, or where that and I don't necessarily need to go on into the dress, so I'm just going to stitch right on top of the bias tape, just so those two pieces stay stuck together. So again, I'm just going to go ahead, back stitch a little, and then stitch all the way down, and then back stitch at the end. And then we're going to go ahead and trim off our seams, or trim off our thread. And now you can see that I've got a nice end for the facing. Now that we have the shorter edge of the bias tape fully stitched all the way around to our armhole, and we've got our armhole edges sewn together, we're going to go ahead and basically just fold the bias tape to the inside. Now remember that outer edge, the other edge of the bias tape, is already folded, and because it's a larger fold, it's actually going to catch the underneath, so that everything will be encased inside this bias tape. So you're going to fold it, as you can see, all the way around, and you can press it if you want, or you can just pin it. I've got a pretty sharp edge here, so I'm just going to go ahead and pin this all the way around to attach the facing to the inside so it lays flat on the inside. There's a couple of ways that you can do this. Obviously, I've turned the facing towards the inside of the garment and pinned it all the way around. Now you could slip stitch this by hand, but I try to avoid hand stitching by all means. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to go ahead and stitch along the outer edge of the bias tape here. Now this will create a sort of top stitch all the way around your armhole. If you're using matching thread, it really won't show up at all, so you probably won't even notice that top stitch. You could also use a contrasting thread and add some detail and interest around the armhole. It's really up to you. I'm going to be using a white, and for this particular fabric, it's not going to show up really all that much because there's a lot of white in my pattern here. Now, the way that I like to do this is basically turn the dress so that I'm looking on the wrong side of the dress garment and the folded right side of the bias tape here. And I just line it up so that my presser foot is holding down on the bias tape, and I've turned my needle all the way to the right so that the needle is right on the outer edge of the bias tape. And I'm basically just doing a straight stitch at a standard 2.5 inch stitch length. And I'm going to do this all the way around to go ahead and tack my facing down. So we're going to do it all the way around. And here is our finished armhole. As you can see, I've got the bias tape on the inside and I've pressed it flat. And you can see that there is this top stitch and you can just barely make it out. And that's because it kind of matches with the pattern. So especially from a distance, no one's ever going to see that. But you can see how nice and clean it looks on the inside of the armhole, and it doesn't have a lot of extra bulk or extra fabric there, which makes it a lot more comfortable to wear. And because we were using the bias tape, it's also easier to create that curve. There's no clipping needed or anything like that because the tape is created on the bias. It's got a lot of extra stretch in it. And here is our completed dress with the bias tape facing around the armholes. If you would like to learn more about the process I went through to making the full dress itself, please visit Akram's Ideas blog. I do have a blog post out there talking about a few minor modifications that I made to the dress in order to get it to fit and to work out to my liking. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Akram's Ideas. And as always, don't forget to follow us on social media or subscribe to our channel. Thanks for watching.